Well, I'm Margaret Whitaker Squires, and Liz and I were both students at Bordner School, where her father was a principal. I had come down from San Fernando, Pampanga in the 4th grade, and so it was the middle of the year, and so I was kind of a new student there. Lizzie, can you tell what you...
Well, I met Margie when we were transferred to Manila. We had been living down in Iloilo, a city down in one of the more southern islands. And we were transferred to Manila at the beginning of 5th grade for me. And I met Margie at the Union Church, I think, at Sunday school. She was a year ahead of me in school.
We went to the same church. We were in the same scout troop, which met at the church.
Yes. So, and we had a lot of mutual friends from that point on.
And what year would have that been? And hang on one thing, how old you were when you first met each other? And
Well, I was 10 years old, and that would have been 1937.
I was 11.
And so here you were friends, and then how old were you when the internment came, and how did you stay in touch?
I was 14 when it came, and a freshman.
I was 15 and a sophomore. Pearl Harbor happened on a Sunday, or no, it happened on a Monday morning. It happened Sunday everywhere else, but it was Monday for us, and we were in school when it happened.
How did you find out about that it was happening?
We heard, well, the news came when I was in the 3rd period of the class day, and word came that I was wanted in the office, so I went down and picked up my sister on the way. My mother and father were waiting for us to take us home. So we were there, we were home by noon. Is that what happened to you, Liz?
No, I had found out about 4:30 in the morning.
Oh.
When the son of one of my dad's teachers had called her to tell her about Pearl Harbor. He was a Navy radioman and had gotten the news. And then his mother called my dad saying, you know, what are we doing about school? Because she taught at the same school, at Bordner School. And my dad, you know, couldn't make the decision without being told by the officials what to do about school. So I knew by the time I arrived at school what had happened.
So then how did you both find out about each other's internment, and were you in touch since you had been friends?
When the Japanese came into the city, they took my family to Villamore Hall, which was just like a student musical or auditorium on a campus, and put us in these chairs, rows and rows of chairs, to wait. They had told us that we were to take enough food for 3 days, food and clothing for 3 days, so that's what we did. We sat in all these chairs. 300 of us or more were in this auditorium, all trying to use the same bathroom. And in fact, one of the women plugged it out. So we were really in dire straits. But finally, after 3 days, they took us to Santo Tomas. And there, Lizzie and a lot of my other friends were waiting to greet us.
How did you feel when you first saw each other?
Oh, every time a new friend came in, it was excitement all over again. You'd run and find everybody else, say, oh, Margie's in camp, here she is, or whoever it was that had just arrived.
And what did you do in camp as activities, or were you staying in beds near each other? Could you choose the beds you wanted and kind of camp out together?
It was mass pandemonium at first because we were in different rooms and we had to find out where our friends' rooms were. It was just like being in a dormitory, but all the women would be in one room and the men would be in another room. We had 3 floors to fill up, and we had beds sent in. But it didn't take us long to find each other, find out where our rooms were.
And then how did you spend your days?
Well, we all had jobs that we worked at. We went to school later on when they got classes going. We spent 90% of the time standing in lines for one thing or another, and we got a lot of sports going.
What kind of sports did you play together? Were you ever on the same team together?
I think we were some of our in basketball. We were on the same team, so we had pickup softball.
Were these all girls' teams?
Yes.
And where were the boys?
They had their own teams.
Yeah.
Did anybody did you all talk about, well, look at that boy over there? Did you try to distract yourself and watch what the boys were doing that were your age? Any cute boys at that point you can remember?
Oh yes, always. We had dates in camp. You didn't do very much. You walked up and down the main road in the camp for a date, and that would be about it. In the evenings. In the daytime, as Liz said, we had camp jobs. Each of us had to have 2 hours of work for the camp.
What was your job for the camp?
My job was working in the hospital kitchen, washing dishes for the noon meal. Liz, you were in.
I started out that way.
Yeah. There were 3 of us, teenagers, that washed dishes. And we had a really neat crew. They were all young Pan American fellows, so of course we thought that was great fun.
When you say Pan American, what do you mean?
Pan American engineers. Pan American had the China Clipper going across, all the Clipper ships, and they had to have a crew. So that's what they were in Manila doing.
So it wasn't as boring as it could have been.
Oh, it was. We made the most of it. You know, when you're a teenager, if you're with your friends, you could make the most of anything.
Were you scared?
Not really.
So okay, go ahead. Yeah.
The only time I was really frightened was during the air raids before we got into camp, because our planes were demolished, and after Pearl Harbor, we had no fleet, we had no Air Force, so they just came over and bombed indiscriminately. And then we did have a few dogfights right over our head, but they came over at will. The Japanese did, and they were pretty dangerous because there were bombs dropping all over.
Once you were in camp, did you both feel kind of safe, and did you look for other of your friends?
Right, and
yeah. I don't think we felt really afraid, except for a few incidents here and there.
What kind of incidents?
Well, I can remember twice when I was totally panicked. The first time was early on when some missionary friends of ours had been in on a pass, and another friend and I walked them down to the main gate to say goodbye to them when they left. And it started to rain, and we ducked under one of the big trees by the main gate. And while we were there, some Japanese guards and that Lieutenant Abiko, who was intensely hated in the camp anyway, dragged in this Filipino man. They had his wrists wired behind him, and they beat him to death. And we were afraid to leave for fear they'd see us. We were afraid to stay for fear they'd see us. And it was just really panicky. And finally, one of the guards started in our direction, and I'm sure he was just going to the commandant's office in the main building to report, but at that point we took off and ran all the way to the main building, and I ran all the way up to my room and never told a soul where I'd been, and because we didn't know how they'd react to realizing somebody had been watching the whole thing. Though when they got through beating him, they wired him to the fence inside the camp where everybody could watch him, and so, but I was really panicked when that happened.
We did try to stay out of the way of the guards. We had our own committee that at first they appointed a committee chairman, but then we voted in our own committee chairman and officers, and so that was really a safety feature for us.
And did your parents instruct you about what to do and not to do? Don't look at a guard this way or that, or did the Japanese commandants tell you how to behave and when to bow and not to bow?
Well, actually, my mother she was the one that got in trouble. She almost got our room in trouble because she didn't want to bow to a Japanese. And when we were standing at roll call, she wouldn't bow. So she did get slapped a little bit, and he let her know that if she didn't, that the whole room would suffer. So she decided it was better to bow than to let everybody else pay for what her independence got her in trouble for.
And so were there any, I mean, you said you always found a way to have fun. I mean, there any anecdotes that actually stood out in your mind, something bizarre that happened, or something that, you really solidified your friendships, or some way you hung together at a certain point?
Well, we have one anecdote that it was all about this Kickapoo joy juice. Because the diet was so bad in camp, my mother had concocted this yeast mixture, and she would just add a little every day, and we added rotten bananas and pineapple and prunes, anything we could throw in there, any fruit. And so when my 18th birthday came in 1944, we decided we were going to have some Kickapoo joy juice. If you remember Lil Abner, the comic, where they had a still where they brewed up this Kickapoo joy juice, this is just what we had. So we brewed it for about 2 weeks. By the time my birthday came around, it was pretty potent. So
each of us had brought some little tidbit to dump into.
And a little brown sugar. Of course, we had so little sugar at the last. In fact, we didn't have any, but this was still June of '44. We had a little bit of sugar at that time. And we diluted it and divided it up and had our brew. And then we went out and played basketball. Played very well, too.
So did this become a regular part of an 18th birthday, or was this just a one-time only?
This was my 18th birthday, right. Mm-hmm.
It was a one-time only. For one
only.
thing, alcoholic beverages were not permitted in the camp.
How did the guards know what you were eating and weren't eating and were drinking? And did they come around, or did your mother just hide it?
Just hid it. Actually, this brew that she had, that we used, was very good as a deterrent against getting beriberi, which is a lack of vitamin B. So that's why she had this concoction to start with. And it made wonderful Kickapoo joy juice. I don't even remember what it tasted like, except that we downed it, thought it was great.
And any other memories of a special event? I mean, eventually what it was Christmas like, or a New Year? Did anybody try to celebrate anything? Year 1, year 2, and then year 3?
We always celebrated Christmas camp-wise. The people would work for months ahead of time making little handmade toys for the little kids so that they'd all have something to get, and then they'd dole out whatever extra they had in the way of sugar or jam or jelly ration, some extra little sweet thing, for the line. And the entertainment committee would always put on a pageant of some sort on the stage. And
what would the Japanese think? I mean, they weren't Christian by and large, so did they understand what was going on at all, or they just...
They ignored it.
They just ignored us. We did have a religious committee too that was the religious committee was made up of all different denominations, of course, and they saw that we had a good Christmas. Also, we put on the Messiah.
Yeah.
And we had wonderful singers in camp, of course, because we had all our different walks of life. Mrs. Foley sang. She was our minister's wife, had a beautiful voice. And Dr. Holter sang. They all put on a wonderful Messiah concert. We even had a string
I was in the
section.
chorus of that too,
and I played the cello.
We worked for months.
Mm-hmm.
So you had instruments you were allowed to bring to camp?
I had my cello brought in, but my strings, of course, didn't last too long in that tropical heat. So our servants sent in a tennis racket string, and I used that for my G string, and it worked. And my Marita Fernandez gave me a guitar string, which was a B flat, and I used that for my A string. So it did work. But of course, halfway through the Messiah, one of the strings just went twang. That was the end of my playing. So I just sat there. But it was really lovely to have all these activities in camp around Christmas time. Well, we had wonderful religious leaders in camp. My parents were not religious, but they saw to it before the war that I got to Sunday school, and in camp we just carried on.
They had church services every Sunday morning of one denomination or another. They had kind of a joke about the Baptist group, because every time the Baptists would schedule their service, these were outdoor. There was a section of the yard where they let us hold it. It would rain, and they'd kid them about, "Oh, you believe in total immersion for baptism." So here's your rainy Sunday.
So were they ecumenical Protestants and then there were the Catholics, or were the Catholics with you?
Catholics had their own mass over in the Catalina hospital area. But we had, the ministers took turns, and every time it was Dr. Holder's turn, the whole history class went to church on Sunday, even the Catholics. And then, of course, they went to confession on Monday morning. But he was popular and gave a wonderful sermon.
And when there was starvation eventually in year 3, were there any wafers for the did you ever ask the Catholics if they were reminded?
I have no idea.
I don't know what they did.
I went to a midnight mass the last Christmas, but I don't remember any wafers.
And were there any Jewish
Yes,
people?
there were Jewish people. Martin Meadows, who's here with us, was saying that the Japanese actually permitted him to go out of the camp on pass to go to his bar mitzvah at the one Jewish synagogue in Manila, which surprised us.
Yes.
But there was a fairly large Jewish community in Manila.
The Schechter, remember?
So an interesting thing is that although the Japanese and the Nazis were allies, the Japanese were not treating the Jews.
Apparently they didn't single them out at all.
The American Jews.
Yeah.
The German Nazis, of course, they were interned when the war was declared, just before the Japanese came in, and then we were interned, and the Germans were let out, the Nazis. But so
There was a big German
yes,
community in Manila.
Did they consider them all Nazis originally?
They did, because remember the Schroeders were not Nazi,
No.
but they were German, so they didn't have to come into camp.
They were
They stayed
interned
outside.
though, because we went and visited
We
Eric
visited
and Werner
there.
while they were interned.
Well, they were interned.
Now, who was interned? The Americans interned?
The Germans.
The Germans.
At the very beginning, you know.
But they always worked for us. In fact, they did some guerrilla activities outside of camp.
These were the German community was divided. The Manila German, there were the ones that were hardcore Nazi Germans, and then there were these other Germans who were not Nazi. They were Germans and, loyal to Germany, but they were not Nazis. And so there was dissension among these two groups. And in fact, the non-Nazi group had a rough time of it during the war because of the Nazi Germans being against them and trying to get them in trouble.
So you had, when you were younger, as, kind of elementary school age, here were these friends of yours in an international community, Germans. Already the war was going on in Europe, and all of a sudden people were being interned. So you already knew that there were foreigners that could be interned.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
There was one family, in fact, the girls were Girl Scouts that we knew. Elsa had gone back to Germany in the 1930s, and she came back to the Philippines as one of Hitler's youth movement. Well, that was the oldest girl,
The boys.
Elsa, yeah. And then there was Krista, who was our age, and I think she was not really Nazi, but their family was. She came back to the States. She and the youngest sister, they went to Willamette University, where I was attending. But here they were, pro-Nazi during the war.
How political were you in school when you were in high school? Did your parents say, "Oh, don't deal with politics"?
No.
No, it never,
It never occurred to
never
us.
came up, really. It was just a very mixed international community with all nationalities and
I remember my Girl Scout troop. I was part of Lizzie's Girl Scout troop, but then Mrs. Bromfield, who was British, started a scout troop right in our neighborhood, and she got a wonderful group of girls to make. We put kits together to send to England. She was very British, but I missed the American troop, but we were really British, but we had a British leader. So we were doing all kinds of wartime good things. That was just before the Japanese came in, though.
So you, as Girl Scouts, you weren't just out there just kind of hiking around and having fun and making little trinkets. You were actually creating care packages for people in Europe?
Our troop did.
So maybe you
It
can
was
just
a
say a whole
smaller troop. It
statement.
was a branch of the original troop. And it was really our neighborhood group. Our neighborhood was made up, it was kind of a cul-de-sac of white people. Although we had a Jewish German family come in who had escaped from Germany that were one of our neighbors too. They disappeared before the war, before Pearl Harbor, so I don't know whatever happened to them. But it was a group that had all these Girl Scouts. Ginny was one of them. And we did a lot of war work for the British.
So you were aware, even as young teenagers, that there was a war in Europe raging?
Oh, yes, definitely.
What did you know about, you mentioned the rape of Nanking, what did you know about the Japanese and the rape of Nanking?
Missionaries that
Knew
came
all
through
about
from
it.
China were always giving us
Yeah.
horror stories about what was going on. They would be coming through Manila on their way back to the States.
So you were pretty savvy as kids,
were
even though
very,
you were.
Yeah.
And how did you, in your groups when you got together, were you just, when the Japanese finally came, how did you find out that the Japanese had actually come? I mean, you said that you got the news about Pearl Harbor, but did you see a lot more movement and activity? Were your parents saying, it looks like things aren't good? I mean, did you have any foreboding of what was going on?
We had the air raids regularly, especially at moonlit
Constant,
night.
yeah.
Moonlit nights were the worst because they could just come over and zero in on their targets. When the Japanese troops came right into Manila, and we knew they were coming because the word had come ahead of them. I was telling Liz, we were comparing notes about people that were Japanese that we knew came in as Japanese soldiers. My father's barber came in as an officer into our neighborhood and was herding us all onto a truck. And then when it came time to go, the driver disappeared. So here this Japanese that we knew got my father to be the driver to drive us to Villiamore Hall, which was where we spent our first 3 days, different from Liz.
And what was your family, what was your father's job, and what was your mother doing, and how did they got into the Philippines?
My father was chief of the field division in the Philippine Sugar Administration. The Philippine Commonwealth was organized as a kind of a in-between between the American run Philippines and independence. And we had promised them their independence in 1946, so this was kind of an interim government, and my father was in that.
And when had your family come to the Philippines?
My father came over in 1920. My brother was born over there in 1922, and I was born on a trip. Oh, another brother. I had 2 brothers, and another was born in 1924. Then I was born in 1926 on a trip home. I was on a reunion trip home. Then my younger sister was born over there. My brother, who was 4 years older, he came to the States and was at the University of Washington when the war broke out. So he became a navigator on a B-29 that bombed Japan. So we were not only in camp, but we had one of our family that was serving.
So when things got bad, I mean, you said people always want the horror stories, but did you all just start to get weaker and weaker and thinner? And just to talk about when you knew things, when did you both realize things were getting really bad?
We cut out basketball, we cut out school finally because we couldn't climb the stairs to the 4th floor.
And the teachers
couldn't teach.
yeah,
So how did you spend those days then?
still the same camp jobs, the same room jobs, and the same everything.
Since you both were working in the kitchen, did you ever try to see if you could get some extra food, or were the Japanese soldiers there watching you?
They cut out, our job was cut out. The new meal was just, we just didn't have it anymore, and so we didn't have a job anymore. Then my family was taken up to Los Baños the last 3 months. So I missed the worst part of the Santo Tomas starvation. We had our own starvation up there, which was very bad too, but it was not quite as bad as Lizzie's camp, because Punky, Yvonne, who will be interviewed tomorrow, she went down to 80 pounds, and I only went down to 83. We had always been the same height and weight growing up from the 4th grade together.
And how did they select some people out to move to Los Baños?
My father was in one of the rooms that the Japanese officers needed. So all the fellows in that room were transferred to Los Baños with their families. So there were 150 of us that went up that last group.
And what was Los Baños like?
It was in the country. It had been an agricultural college. There were barracks instead of a big building. We had a lot more banana trees, and it was more of a country atmosphere. But we did have the barbed wire around us with the Swally fence.
When they decided to move, were you scared that you were actually being transported somewhere? You were all being herded into what, trucks or?
No, because we were herded into trucks at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the whole camp, I think, turned out to see us go. When we got to the train station, here was this huge flare that was lit over us. We knew that it must have been an American flare. It was in December, and the air raids had started, so I felt very good about that because I felt that our troops knew what was happening, and we weren't frightened. But my dad was so sick that when we had to hike up from the train station in Los Baños to the camp there, he fainted and was put in the hospital.
How did you feel leaving your friends, though? Were you afraid for them, leaving them, or were you just kind of everything with days?
I wasn't afraid leaving them, and of course we had friends up in Los Baños, so we were greeted for more friends, but I didn't miss the friends I had in Santo Tomas.
How did you wonder what was happening to each other over those 3 months?
There was news back and forth between the two camps.
And how did the liberation happen at Los Baños?
That was really a wonderful thing for us because the 11th Airborne were our rescuers, and they sent their reconnaissance ahead of time. They crossed the lake in Bancas. My husband was one of them, my husband-to-be. So they navigated without any motors. They just had a sail. And every time they went by a Japanese patrol boat, of course, they all had to hide, and it was pitch dark. So Martin and his group, there were 4 sections, and he had one section that he was responsible for, with about 20 guerrillas behind him and 2 other reconnaissance fellows. He got to this fork in the road before getting to the camp, and he turned around and they weren't there. So he had to run back, and Jane Lynch and this other GI were waiting for him. They knew that he would come back because the guerrillas had disappeared, and he never saw them again. The guerrillas were a wonderful help, but there were some of them that were not disciplined, and they just didn't obey orders. They decided it was time for him to leave. So he came on into camp, and they around the camp and killed the Jap guards, set the flares for the fellows that came C-47s to jump. And before the morning, before an hour was up, while they were in camp, they had it secured. They were getting us out of there. To go back across the lake on Amtrak's. The Amtrak's had been coming across all night. We could hear the noise of the Amtrak's and wondered why the Japanese didn't do something
Can't
about it.
imagine.
But part of the 11th Airborne sent a section over to fool the Japanese, thinking that they thought that the troops were coming from another direction, while the recon and the Company B fellows came in to get us out. So here came these Amtrak's crashing through the gate. In fact, Martin was one that directed them. And then they loaded us on, 40 to an Amtrak, and chugged across the lake to another part of the lake, which was behind American lines.
And then how long was it before you made it to the United States, and how did you get here?
But we stayed in a camp that was outside of Munting. We were taken to this place called Munting a New Bilibid prison, and everybody was taken there, and we stayed there for about 3 weeks before we came back down to Manila. Then from Manila we were taken to the States.
Tell me about, when you knew you were going to go to the States. Was your family all together at that time?
My dad stayed over, but my mother and sister and I came to the States because I was ready for college, and the GIs wanted us out of there. You stayed, but most of us left for the States.
What was your first impression when you came to the States? What did you expect to see, and when had you been on your last home leave here, if ever?
We were very suntanned, and so we got lots of whistles. But when we got to the States, my aunt and uncle in Los Angeles, they came to greet us, and they took us shopping for clothes. So then we came on up the train to Seattle after that.
What did it seem like to have that experience being out in a store and shopping and food and abundance?
It was another adventure.
So maybe you could say that whole thing. What was your first impression of the United States when you came here?
All those people, and of course I was used to a lot of black heads, black hair, and here were all these blondes and redheads. It was quite a different experience. I was 18 then, my sister was 15. So as I said, it was another adventure.
When you went to college, did you ever talk to anybody about what you had been through?
My mother gave talks to the Kiwanis and the Rotary clubs. The older people had a much worse time than we teenagers.
But when was it that you actually told somebody what you had been through?
It was a few weeks after I got over there. I had another aunt and uncle in Bellingham who took us in. And my mother was giving talks, and I did give a talk or two also.
And then when you got to college and made friends, where did you apply to college, and what did you decide you wanted to become?
I was going to Western at first I was supposed to go to the U. I took one look and decided that a smaller college was what I wanted, and Western was right there in Bellingham.
How did you meet your husband, and how did you find out and stay in touch in that whole situation?
He had to go back.
Okay, so
right
my
away.
husband, okay, yeah.
Yeah, my husband had to go back, or Martin had to go back and fight, because they had gone behind the lines to get us out of there. Then they had to go back and take the towns. And the Filipinos who were in the town of Los Baños that was another tale of atrocity, because the Japanese took it out on them, and they tied people to their posts around their houses and burned them. It was a terrible thing that they did. They thought that the Filipinos had aided and abetted us. Of course, they did in a way. The guerrillas did, but that was one of the cruel things that happened. So Martin had to go back, and his group all went back and took the town of Los Baños.
How did you meet Martin?
He came to Bellingham.
Okay, so Martin. Okay.
Martin came to Bellingham after he got back from service, because his parents had moved there during the war. They were from the Olympic Peninsula in the state of Washington. He was a senior at the U, but he decided to just rest for a while, and his mother got tired of him hanging around the house. So she said, "Why don't you look up these people who were in the camp who rescued you?" So that's what he said. "Oh, Mom, you do it." And she did. She called, and he called. Then we met, and we just clicked right away. So that took care of that. And a year later we were married.
And how did you find out what had happened to Liz? Did you ever try to stay in touch?
Oh, we did. We sent notes back and forth all the time.
And when did you know that Liz was coming to the United States?
We went back to Santo Tomas, and were you in Santo?
When you came back down there?
From Los Banos, we came back
Yeah.
down to Santo Tomas because our whole neighborhood was burned to the ground. We just stayed in camp where the GIs fed us until it was time for us to go. And you went earlier than we
No,
did.
we stayed
Oh, you
a
stayed the whole time.
year later. We left.
And then how did you know that Liz was
We
coming
wrote-
to the U.S.? Oh, okay.
We
so-
wrote letters
We
back
wrote
and forth.
letters, kept in touch. In fact, we wrote long letters.
Yes.
And how did you tell Liz about meeting Martin and that whole thing?
I
don't
just-
remember.
You met Walt and I met Martin. We each had our dates and you were married after we were, but that long after.
And Waltz was somebody who had had a World War II experience?
Well, at the tail end of it, he was my age, so he was just getting out of high school towards the end of the war, but he joined the Navy and was on an LSM. But I met him at college here in the States.
And so your experiences then over the years, I mean, other than a reunion, do you ever kind of talk about things that happened over this time? I mean, in camp, do you ever kind of common camp experiences that keep reoccurring? You say, oh, you remember that? I mean, not to come here and tell me about something that might be something that you might kind of say.
The Kickapoo Joy Juice.
Yes. Okay, and Martin and Walt got along so well. Martin was a senior at the U, and when he graduated, we were married. But he and Walt had a lot of fun, and we got together quite a bit.
A lot, yeah. Well, our kids were growing up, so our kids all know each other.
We went Christmas tree hunting together up in the woods.
Yeah.
We did a lot of things.
So when you talk about times that were tough starvation, I mean, did any of your children really ever ask you what it was like? How did your children see you, your grandchildren see you as having been essentially prisoners of war?
I think when they were growing up, it didn't really register.
We were too busy doing other things.
Except for Dennis telling his class he's must have been in prison.
Yes.
But yeah, since they've been grown, that they've gotten it. Right now, my daughter's very interested in it, and have come to some reunions with me, and are just really interested in it. And the grandkids now are my grandkids.
Yes.
So when you see teenagers today obsessed with trying to be thin, and I mean, what is your perspective on the whole thing? Have you ever talked to any of them and said, starving to death intentionally?
No, not really.
Ever thought about the ludicrous part of
Yeah. Every once in a while that crosses my mind. I think they don't know how lucky they have it.
I was so hungry the other day when we were at the Smithsonian that we went without lunch. I thought, well, this isn't so bad. I've been hungry.
Did either of you have serious medical effects from starvation that you know of?
No, they say there is a condition of where the circulation of the end of your fingers is poor. When I had that, I was at the University of Washington and studying for finals.
Oh.
But I think that was just stress that was doing that.
Maybe this isn't something Bonnie wants to get into, but how do either or both of you feel about the issue of compensation, recognition, that whole issue about how many people that have had World War II experiences have been recognized in some ways? What are your feelings?
Well, on the compensation issue, there were some people who came back who really desperately needed financial help. Fortunately, we weren't in that category, so I don't know, but they should have been compensated some way, I feel. What we actually all got from our government was $1 a day for adults and 50 cents a day for children. So the issue of this double compensation that the Japanese got for being interned here got pretty sticky because, that feeling, well, they're getting a heck of a lot more than we got.
The British got.
And
quite a
they
bit,
just
though.
recently, and the ones from the Netherlands, several other countries, Canada, Australia, England, gave big compensation packets to all of their civilian ex-POWs.
Do you hold, was there any time when the United States government should have come to the companies and the teachers and the civilians there and said, get out now, things are looking bad? Or, I mean, was there any talk in your family about we better leave? Having seen what happened to like the German,
They kept telling us not to leave. In fact, they clamped down, in the documents, I guess, have fairly recently surfaced to back up this rumor that's been around all these years, that they clamped down and told the High Commissioner's office not to issue any more passports or validate any, that they did not want Americans leaving there because it would undermine the Filipinos' morale. And then this group of American businessmen, when the bombing first started, and all the ships lines were getting their ships out of the harbor in a hurry just to get them to safety. And they approached the High Commissioner's office there in State Department, say, couldn't we send out the women and children on these empty ships that are leaving? And they said, no, that's...
The military had sent out their reserve, well, their military families back in February, because that's when Virginia left.
Yeah.
so you knew people that were leaving. Were your parents saying, well, maybe we should go? Did they try to apply to get out? Or would it just...
That said that her father tried and he was turned down.
But since
At
my
the
dad
Commissioner's
was...
office.
Right. But my dad, since he worked for the Philippine government, I had lived there for 20 years.
Yeah.
Didn't want to leave. My mother didn't want to leave either.
What was your rapport with the Filipinos throughout the war? I mean, did they try to support your at the camp? Did they try to bring you food? You had servants, quote unquote. What was your relationship with them before, during, and after the war?
Very good. They were good relations.
Really was.
They
And
were very loyal.
All our Filipino friends were sending things into us, and they were helping every way they could.
But at the last, the Japanese wouldn't let them send anything in.
Were your servants living in the home with you? And what happened to them when you had to leave your home?
We just had one house girl stay. I think the others just melted back to San Fernando, where they had come from. She was there when the Japanese torched the neighborhood and was killed with her baby. And I understand from the friend that's out in Silver Spring that the Japanese did machine gun people who tried to leave their burning homes.
Did you find out about that after the fact from your parents, or did you know pretty much what was going on the whole time?
One of our neighbors, who happened to be out at the time because her husband had tuberculosis, had dug an underground tunnel to the barrio behind a fence outside our neighborhood. She's the one that told us about our house girl. They did escape, but that's how we found out about that.
We heard about a lot of what was going on, too, from people who streamed into the camp after we were liberated, but the battle for intention and safety. And they were bringing, a lot of our friends came in. We would hear firsthand accounts from them, as most of them would lose parts of their, and they didn't stay in intact families. They were all losing family members, and it was really, really bad in that battle for Manila.
So when you first both came to the United States, well, you were in the West Coast there in Washington. There's quite a few Japanese Americans, some of whom may have been interned. A little complicated, but as a 18, 19, 20-year-old, what were your feelings toward Japanese Americans, never having lived in this country, really?
The Japanese American friends that I have been just great. I did have one friend who was very resentful of being put in an internment camp, but the others were very philosophical about it because they realized that it was wartime, and there were elements in the Japanese community that were very pro-old country.
Were they surprised that there had been white people that had been interned in the Philippines by the Japanese? Did they understand that you had a parallel internment experience, and how did they react?
I don't know how surprised they were, because they must have known. Well, maybe they didn't, but we were always good friends afterwards. The war was over.
But do you think that possibly it made them more empathetic? Did they know when you met them? Did you say, oh, they said, well, we were interned, and you said, well, I was interned? Did you have a kind of a common, strange, but a common experience of having had some of your teenage years where the freedom really wasn't there? Did you ever talk about it?
We only talked about it once, and the fact that we were so hungry and starving, and there were atrocities that they knew about. We never really made an issue of it. There was one friend who was Japanese living in Seattle, and she didn't even know about Pearl Harbor. Now this is where the surprise came. But she and Martin, they had quite a talk, and they ended up crying on each other's shoulders over Pearl Harbor.
Tell me individually what both of you remember the day that you heard that Hiroshima and then Nagasaki had been bombed by the atomic bomb. Do either of you remember those days?
Oh yes, I remember it very vividly because we were fairly close to it. We were in Manila when that was going on, and actually the main feeling was of relief that the war was ending. That it was first that I'd heard of atomic energy or something, so that was what is this? I mean, it's this awesome new thing. But I think mainly it was bringing the war to a close, and that was the biggie. Mm-hmm. And we also knew that any prisoners, American prisoners in Japan, or any of the Japanese prisons in Japan or northern China or wherever they held them, were under orders to kill them if American troops approached. Mm-hmm. So we knew what an invasion would do.
Martin would not have survived that probably, because he would have been in the first wave to go into Japan. And this friend, this Japanese friend, her father was one of the main civil defense workers in Tokyo. In fact, she had a picture on her wall of her father and mother. Her father was standing with the Order of the Chrysanthemum, which was an award given to him for his work with the civil defense. She's one that was so surprised to hear about the atrocities. But we just felt there would have been so many more casualties if it hadn't been for the atomic bomb. And
they were not going to surrender.
They wouldn't have surrendered. In fact, they were developing one of their own.
Yeah, they were within a hair's breadth
of their own atomic bomb.
Yeah.
When the Germans were defeated, do you remember that day where were you both VE Day?
I was still in Manila.
We were going through Eugene, Oregon, on the way north on the train, and we went right through Eugene. Everybody was standing on either side of the railroad track, just shouting and yelling, "Germany has surrendered." And it was just wonderful. But we kept piling on through. We didn't stop.
I bet that was the difference between you being here in the States, where the European front was the big thing, and me being still in Manila, where it was the Pacific front that mattered. So VE Day was great, but it wasn't the tremendous thing that VJ Day was. And I think it's just because different sides of the world were looking at it, from different angles.
So if you have to look back now and say to your grandchildren or somebody that's a teenager, what's the most valuable experiences you think you probably took away from this as you look back on your lives at that time in the camp? Yes, there were awful things, you were restricted. I mean, are there certain lessons that you think helped you endure everything else you have your whole life because of that?
You learn to cope with whatever's going on instead of, having a rigid path to follow and roll with the punches.
That's right, and we were very tolerant of each other. We had some strange people in camp, and we tolerated them. And they tolerated us. They tolerated us. We had to.
What career paths did you follow, or what family paths did you follow after college?
I didn't finish college until my youngest was junior high and high school, and then I embarked on a teaching career in midlife, which I loved.
Well, I got married this summer after college, and so I never really had a job, instead I've gotten so swamped with volunteer work with the Red Cross, instructing in all sorts of things with Girl Scouts
Girl
that I'm
Scouts.
still very active in, and different church things. And for quite a while, living in San Antonio, I worked for the school district as a swim instructor for their PE program till they cut that out. And then
So do you think that potentially your life experiences have made you kind of have this public service, feeling of public service? I mean, there are plenty of people that just kind of, that's next, and then they go and play golf. Not that that's a bad thing, or they go into retirement. Yeah, I mean, they just don't really. Talk to me maybe about you think, and what about your family members? Was social or civic responsibility a part of their lives when they came back to the United States?
my mother and father were definitely very involved in all sorts of organizations, and right up until they died, just about, and very active in the community. And my grandmother, of course.
Mm-hmm. And Mark was a Boy Scout leader, and I was a Girl Scout leader. we followed about the same paths.
Yeah.
We did a lot of volunteering, church work. We did those in those days, though. We were young mothers, and that's what young mothers did back in the 1950s.
When you look back on their like wartime experiences, I mean, when Korea, when Vietnam came up, was there any, and your own children, were there any involvement of your own children in other wars?
Well, let's see, we sweated out the Korean War because my husband was in the reserves, but he didn't get called back. We sweated out the Vietnam War because our son was the right age, but they were going by numbers, as they called them up, and that just before they got almost to his number, the war ended and they stopped calling them. And then since then, there hasn't been. Our granddaughter's husband now is with the Air Force, so who knows what's going to happen there.
Right, and my sister's husband was in the Korean War. He was in the Navy. He survived, and my two sons were too young, and then my daughter's husband was in Vietnam. He was an MP over there.
Yeah, I just wondered, if there was anybody that had any
But
war.
nobody, yeah.
Right. So, was there anything? So these reunions, you've been getting together for these reunions for many years now. So, so when was the first reunion? When did everybody decide to get in touch? Do you remember? And
It was in California, and it was while my parents were still living and out there, so it must have been in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Mine was in 1985.
And they had a series of them over the years out in California that were smaller, and then gradually they started expanding them. And they're held erratically; they're not on a regular schedule. So
They tried to have them every 5 years, and then they were having them every 3 years.
sort of whenever somebody will decide, oh, I'm going to pull together a reunion.
Right. And California was really the place where
San Diego.
I was teaching school, and February is the day that, or February is the month where they would have the reunions. Well, February for me meant report card time, so we never got away till we retired.
Mm-hmm.